take a look at what a week this stock has had. You're coming off of, again, 2 tough weeks, and then this week you had gains of 7%, a drop of 4, gains of 7%, a small decline today, but it's otherwise been a very wild ride. The fundamentals, at least this week, Caroline, getting a little bit better as, for instance, the Mexican lower house has passed a cannabis bill. So this is really, Caroline, a sign of broadening legislation. And then, of course, selling some stock to help fund that U.S. expansion.
Let's dig into this stock now more. Aurora Cannabis CEO is joining us, and pleased to say Miguel Martin's with us, bringing with him, of course, about 25 years' experience in consumer packaged goods, highly regulated industries, and, well, U.S. cannabinoid space. Let's dig into that cannabinoid space because, Miguel, what does the Mexican legalization, potential legalization, mean for you, for Aurora, and for the U.S.-Canadian competitive dynamic?
Well, thanks for having us. I think it's just another indication globally about progress that we're making through comprehensive, cannabinoid legislation. We saw 5 states last year in the U.S., pass pretty comprehensive legislation, New Jersey and obviously, Virginia. And around the world, Aurora today sells its products in over 13 countries. And what we see is time and time again, those companies that have a strong compliance, science, and regulatory, experience are going to win all in all. So we're excited about the Mexico opportunity. We're also excited about other opportunities such as Israel and other parts of the world in which we've been successful.
What about the U.S., Miguel? I mean, what are the options there?
I think the U.S. is very interesting. So when you think about the U.S., I would argue that it's as much an economic issue, as it is a social issue. And we're going to see progress there. What I do believe is that you'll see a federal framework that seems to make the most sense. And the FDA, and other regulatory agencies will be involved. I would expect under that framework, they would look to other markets where there's been success. The Canadian LPs and Aurora specifically have a significant advantage in that environment, given, the number 1 medical company in Canada. We operate, in a compliance-driven way in 13 countries. And I think that bodes well for Aurora in the U.S. at a time in which it's made legal.
I want to press you on some of that U.S. expansion. Analysts, on one hand, really like the news of selling $1 billion in securities to help fund that expansion. The flip side of that coin, though, is that these lofty valuations, success in the U.S. is already priced in. If you don't have success, the shares could decline. How do you think about that?
Well, I think first thing to remember, we have the number 1 Nielsen-ranked CBD brand in the U.S., Reliva, which we're excited about. I think, the U.S. is going to be a big market. It's a question, not of if, but when. And then you look at what are the attributes of a, company that's going to be successful. Aurora's had a great year, whether it's been improvements in overall cash flow or it's our balance sheet. If I remember, $500 million. You mentioned what we just announced. We're going to be in a strong position to be successful in the U.S. I think we're in the early innings of what the U.S. is going to look like. But clearly a company like Aurora that's been successful around the world, in Canada, and the largest current regulated market, will be successful in the U.S. as well. And so I think, we'll have to prove to those folks that have those questions. But you have to look at experience. And I think Aurora's proven that we have that experience to be successful at a time in which the U.S., legalizes cannabis.
Miguel, of course, in large part because of the ability to trade Canadian-listed businesses, marijuana businesses, by retail, your stock has been on a pretty wild ride. How distracting is that as the CEO of a business? I'm sure you'll tell us that you don't really pay attention to the share price, but your shareholders do, your stakeholders do. And how much of a concern is it that retail can move it around so much?
Well, listen, given, the things you mentioned and the lack of broad-based institutional investment in the cannabis stocks, you do have an overweight on the retail investors, and clearly they're going to operate differently. I think at the end of the day, though, our objective is the same, whether we have a strong percentage of institutional investors or retail investors, which is to prove quarter over quarter that we're making progress in the key fundamentals. What we are pleased with is that we're seeing more interest from institutional investors. And I think, that will steady the stock out a bit. And yes, it's, it is out there and it is something that you look at, but we look at it over a longer period of time. And I think, quarter over quarter or year over year, there's a lot to like about the Aurora story. And I think that's beneficial, whether it's a retail investor or an institutional investor.
With regards to how the industry adapts to potential expansion in the various countries that we've talked about, including in the U.S., including in Europe, do you see a potential here, or do you even see a need here for consolidation?
Well, I mean, clearly we just saw consolidation between two companies. I think once you get to a certain scale, you don't need to be bigger to be competitive. You're going to have a certain amount of, resources and capital in order to manage both the medical business and the recreational business, manage a global business so that you can have not only sales and marketing, but also production. So I think there is a certain level of scale required. I think we're definitely at that. We don't need to be any bigger, I think, as we demonstrated with our business. But as things get more competitive, and as you get into the U.S., you are going to need to have a certain size and a certain balance sheet, which is why the decision we just made, plus the cash we have on the balance sheet, plus the history that we've had in other markets, I think benefits a company like Aurora.